Epic. We are recording. So my name is Kara-Leah. I am recording this for the Yoga Lunchbox. Hi, Yoga Lunchbox people. I am interviewing today Dr. Scott Lyons. This is the third time that we have chatted, and
Yeah.
I'm stoked. I love getting you back to chat because I feel like you always progress as a practitioner, which we'll dive into in a moment. But for those of you that don't know Dr. Scott Lyons, he does a lot of work with Tara Judell. He is part of Embodied Flow. He's a clinical psychologist, an osteopath, a body-mind medicine practitioner, and he has this huge string of letters after his name because he is qualified in all kinds of therapies, which I cannot remember. Reiki, I know that's one of them. But if you go to his website, which is linked below, you can see that he really knows his stuff. He likes to live by the principle, expand our capacity to meet and be met. And I love that. It's a beautiful principle. Can you explain what that
Yeah.
means to you? Like why? Because that's on your about page at the bottom. You know, it's like you've chosen, of all the things you've chosen to highlight.
Yeah. I mean, I could start from a lot of different directions with that. Like, one of my favorite quotes is by Martin Buber, who just says, "All real living is meeting." And
Mm.
I love that. And like, that to be alive means to be in relation. And that's
Mm-hmm.
in relation to ourself, in relation to another person, in relation to the environment. And I think meeting relationship is something we might take for granted. That, I mean, maybe. I know I did. And and I think that the levels of depth of experience, or the levels of relationship that have unveiled themselves in my own personal practice and in working with other individuals, really demonstrates this process that, we can say, oh, I'm in a room with you and therefore I'm in a relationship and I'm meeting you. Like the same way I'm
Mm-hmm.
in the jungle right now in Bali, I'm sort of in relation to the jungle. But then there's this whole actually experience of yielding into contact, or even into
Mm.
myself, what it
Mm.
is to like feel sadness versus to actually meet the sadness, to make contact with this part of ourselves, of what's actually present. And so
Mm-hmm.
this, what I'm really interested in is this growing capacity of depth, of really meeting every of ourselves, of the world around us, of nature. Because when we meet that from more of the philosophical perspective, we are meeting ourselves. That this
Mm-hmm.
is the self, and this
Mm.
is the self, and you
Mm.
are the self. And so when we really come into that, what we're talking about is in like this embodied consciousness, this way in
Mm-hmm.
which we are coming in to the fundamental aspect of ourselves, the building
Mm-hmm.
blocks, the sort of substrate of who we all are, of what we all are. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, growing our capacity to meet has many levels. It can be just fundamentally like, I'm in a better relationship with my partner or a friend of mine. But then it goes all the way into this real depth of experience of that real living is through this deep contact of meeting, this deep yielding into our
Mm.
fundamental nature.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it's on
I
my
love
about
that.
page.
Yeah, and this is why I love talking to you because you have such a beautiful way to describe what it means to live yoga,
Yeah.
what it actually means to be in the practice. I can't remember where it was, but recently, like this week, I saw someone or read someone describe awakening as nothing more than immersing into reality.
Yeah.
And when I
Uh,
read that, I was like, oh my
yeah.
God, that's what I'm going to say, awakening. Because what does it mean to awaken? It's like to immerse
Mhm.
into reality. And I get that same sense, like to really meet
Yeah.
what's there.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, if we think about it like there is reality, and I put it in quotations, like sort of the sort of fantasial reality, the sort of
mm,
conceived, constructed reality, and then there's the reality of nature. And we really, what's so beautiful about quantum physics and why it's poetic is that because it's describing the nature of nature and its inherent
mm,
design, or what we could say the mind of nature. And um, and the process of awakening is really, it's sort of, you know, it's opening our eyes, it's unveiling to our essential reality, to our essential nature. So it's not some, I don't think about it as some hierarchical, like, and then I ascend to this level, developmental level of awakening. It's sort of it's wiping the dust off the mirror or the lenses of our perceptual experience, so that it becomes that much less dirtied or dusty or whatever we want to say. That's sort of creating an illusion of that constructed reality as opposed to our fundamental reality. And what I think is really important about the fundamental reality is it's not a concept. It's not something, again, that we ascend to, that is some conceptual nirvanic place. It is actually, the word you used before was immersive, but I like to use the word absorb. That we absorb back into essentially flow, the way, the Tao. There's every major religion and philosophy has another word for this process of basically reabsorbing into this essential nature. And that takes relationship or connection. So growing our capacity to meet and be met, which is actually the element of relationship, because I can sort of meet someone but not allow them to meet me. And that's not really relationship until there's a reciprocity of connection. And in that reciprocity, I build a bridge essentially to make contact again with this more fundamental nature. And that process is a name for it is just awakening to my true nature, that which has sort of been veiled from my tangible experience. So it's already there. We're waking up to what's already here, as opposed to like, and then I do my due diligence and my meditation every day and my mantra, and I ascend to the next level, which is outside of here, which is simply, to me, not true. Like, I am already awake. It's kind of awakening to my awakeness. I am already my essential nature.
Yeah. But the things that conceal that from us, right? And the ways in which, I think when I was reading through some of your stuff, I saw that, I think it might have been on Instagram, you said something along the lines of how we construct ourselves in relationship to trauma, right? And so when I read that, I was like, what separates us out from or conceals us from all of those things, in essence, is pain, isn't it? Or trauma, or not the thing itself, but how we relate to the thing.
It's you know, I appreciate so deeply the last 25 years, people like Peter Levine and Bessel, all of these pioneers who are really bringing awareness of what trauma is into the common sort of dialogue and conversation. And part of the challenge of that is that we become sort of reactive to even the language. And it's called dramatic narrative to a word. So if I even say the word trauma, it can have its own reactivity that I am responding to that doesn't necessarily allow me to interface with the experience that needs to originally be processed. If that makes sense. So
it does make sense, yeah.
So if my relationship to having trauma has its own narrative and story that keeps me one or two or multiple steps away from actual interfacing and contacting with the organic process that wants to unfold and complete in order to mobilize that trauma in the body. So
I see that quite often in spiritual circles, whereby people will intellectually know their triggers per se, and they'll talk about their triggers, and they might attempt to control other people by saying, don't do that, you'll trigger me. Or
Yeah.
But they're not actually there. There's another layer of self-construct coming around the thing, rather than what you're saying, meeting and absorbing and processing the thing itself.
Yeah, where it becomes actually about the conceptual idea of trauma as opposed to the felt experience of what's here. It's not just that, they become coupled. And so it can become counterproductive to the process of healing. And this is what I'm referring to is elements of neurolinguistics and linguistics, of how we look at language itself creating experience, as opposed to contacting the experience as the experience, which is more somatics.
And of course, as human beings, we're so freaking smart around wanting to protect ourselves from feeling pain. And we've figured out how we can use story, narrative, neurolinguistic elements to protect us from pain. So the very thing, it becomes, And it becomes, so you're undoing that.
Yeah. And that's been a big part of, my work, especially around stress, is uncoupling or neutralizing the language so that we can get to the experience. Because when the language itself is so heightened and arousal producing, it doesn't allow us to be with what's actually happening from stimulus. We have what's called, what could be considered more of a bias response to the concept, as opposed to what's actually happening in the interface or relationship with stimulus.
So we've naturally moved into one of the offerings you're bringing to New Zealand and Australia in February, which is somatic stress release. So let's just name that right now.
Sure.
So you're coming to give that in Wellington and Queenstown here in New Zealand, and you're also delivering it in Australia. Is that right? Somatic stress release? Yeah. So obviously, from what you've just said, you're really looking at how things present in the body as opposed to the concepts we have about the thing.
Yeah. And that's a really...
So what kind of...
go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You go.
Well, it's a subtle thing that makes a profound difference. If let's take something relatively neutral like purple. And all of a sudden, purple becomes associated with exactly... Man, we're just on the same page.
It's the flow.
So purple becomes coupled or associated with something like pain. So what we've done is overcouple the concept of pain with purple. And every time, very classical cognitive behavioral psychology, where that overcoupling becomes where the purple itself becomes the activation arousal, and as opposed to what's that you were holding up? There was a scarf or something.
Yeah, it's to clean my whiteboard actually.
But yeah, it's like just
a piece of material.
So and what I'm missing in the response to purple in this moment is, how are you holding it? What does it do? What's the texture feel like of that? What's the tangible qualities and characteristics that's happening in the now? And when I sort of neutralize the term purple pain and come back into what is the felt resonance and experience in the now, recognizing it might be associated with past experience as well. And how do I make contact or be in relationship with what's here, as opposed to the concept construction of the name purple or pain? So there's a way we do that.
I see that. Yeah. So, because that often happens in people's lived experiences where they get triggered. There's an out of context emotional response to something quite innocuous. But they have this intense emotional experience to it because it's connected to the past. Yeah.
And strangely enough, purple in this instance is just another way of me saying stress. Yeah. So we have our own association with the idea of stress without knowing necessarily the details of the the mechanics and the psycho-emotional, spiritual, energetic components of what's actually happening. We can read it from, there are things that in like pop psychology that sort of give a very sort of dynamic or dramatic concept of stress, which creates its own activation arousal, which keeps and maintains your attention and your projection and charge around the word itself, as opposed to what is the experience of stress in your body. So there's a way in which that continues to cycle, because stress as a more in a popular concept sells. And when you create arousal, this is how all marketing works. When you create an arousal response, your eyes narrow into a particular focus point. So you lose some of your peripheral vision and come into more direct contact, which maintains attention. And in marketing, you want that. Marketing as a genre, as we know it, modern day marketing, is actually, there are huge fields or schools dedicated to neuroscience and marketing. They do research, not just on like what are people attracted to, but looking at brain science and behavioral science in marketing. And we know that fear or arousal-based marketing, things that create sort of a reaction, draws your attention in more. And what's unfortunate about that in stress is that it's continuously being perpetuated in the ways we talk about stress, and the ways we are engaging with stress are coming from that very heightened, activated marketing kind of perspective of stress, as opposed to getting to know it or making contact and relationship from the place where we know things, which is the body.
But that means we don't actually have to feel uncomfortable things.
That's called living. All real living is meeting. That's called living. If someone said to me, I don't want to ever feel stress again, I would say that would likely mean you were dead. Sorry.
So how do you define stress then? Like, what is stress? What's the definition of stress?
Well, one of the things to recognize is that stress as an umbrella term is holding two components that we can easily talk about, which is stressor and a stress response. So the combination of the two is what people are referring to as stress. So it's helpful to even, deconstruct it a little bit of, are we going to focus on the stress response, which is my psycho-emotional, spiritual, physiological reaction to a stressor, which is a stimulus.
So if I'm stuck in a traffic jam, that's the stressor, the stimulus.
Could be. It could be. That's the thing yes, it is the stimulus, but
you can have two different people that would have a very different experience based on the meaning they attribute to it, like how it triggers story, their previous life experience in traffic jams, how much they like to control their environment, like all of those factors. So I could be in the traffic jam and have zero stress response in my body, and someone else might have maximum stress response in their body.
Well, the good news is you will always have a stress response. That's what being alive entails. To have a stress response means you're living and adapting to stimuli.
So the nervous system is never completely like chillaxed.
Well, this is sort of, again, the sort of dramatic narrative. It is relaxed.
Yeah.
I'm going to pick up my smoothie. I'm chill. That's me shifting to a new stimuli. That's a stress response. To the extremes of what we're talking about, when it's like, you're in overheated, you're unable to attend to other things, there's more extreme phases of a stress response. It's still part of the scale of our response system. And if we are in the actual cycle of response, all good.
Mm-hmm.
It's when our cycle of response to stimuli gets thwarted or challenged or obstructed, whether that be from our own putting on the brakes, culturally, environmentally, if there's no permission, if there's no time, that's where we get disease. Stress is not the disease. It's our inability to have our processing of our biological response.
Right. Now that's a really important distinction to make, that stress is a normal response to life as it happens, and it has a natural cycle. It comes and goes, it resolves.
Yeah.
The problem is when there's a blockage of some description coming from one of those. So someone has an idea that, oh, I'm this amazing yogi and I don't get stressed. And this might be a subtle idea. And so when there's a stress response, there might be a natural stress response, and it may even be unconscious, but literally pushing that away because it doesn't align with the self-construct of being a yogi with no stress. Right? And that can all be unconscious. And I can see potentially that would then begin to add up in the system, wouldn't it?
For sure. I mean, look, you turn on a car and you are revving the engine and you just keep petting the car and saying, calm down, but you keep revving it at the same time. Eventually the car is going to overheat. It's the nature of our system. And I don't know, when you mentioned that yogi who's like, it's all good, I'm calm, keep calm and carry on. Or it's a yogi's way is to be in utter bliss. That's what we love to call suppression and overriding.
Yeah, awesome.
And it's not actually our human nature, nor is it a yogic nature to lose contact with what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
We are divorcing ourselves from ourselves by saying, oh, I don't get angry, or I don't get activated by that. It is our nature to, as part of meeting and responding, to actually have an arousal response. It doesn't end there. It's the misconception that that's what stress is just the activation arousal. It's not. That's one element of a much bigger cycle of response.
Mm-hmm. So when the cycle has an ability to resolve as such, to go completely through, then it's like, it's all sweet, right?
Sweet. Brilliant. That's called living. That's called well-being, actually. That is our fundamental well-being, is when we are in that movement of that cycle that helps us maintain homeostasis. So, so it's really kind of a radical process of meeting and making contact, of being in a relationship to something we're calling stress, in order to feel empowered and responsive in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can see, like, I had an experience back in maybe 2000 where it was a situation where basically got stressed. I was stressed, but I was attempting to like push it down and not be, and be totally okay with what was happening, and deny it and deny it and deny it. And then that was like a whole evening, like 3 or 4 hours of attempting to be okay with what was unfolding by pretending that it, and about 6 months after that, I started getting panic attacks every time there was a repeat of that particular situation. And now, from what you were saying, I'm like, oh, now I understand exactly A, B, C, what was unfolding there.
The panic attacks in this way can be basically a signaling that says we've been here before and it's incomplete in the response of it. So there's a way in which the cycle has been thwarted. And so in somatic stress release, we're really looking at, what does the cycle itself feel like? So that is not something I theoretically see on a whiteboard or on a piece of paper. It's, what does this actually feel like, so that I can use that experiential data or information to help me in my own continual self-practice, but also in working with other people, to help continue the process of when those cycles have been thwarted. And look, that happens all the time. Like if there's, let's say right now there's construction out my window, and I may not feel like I have the permission or the space right here, even though I do, to have sort of my response cycle through it, through my stress response cycle. And in that, I'm thwarting, or I'm challenging into my own basic physiological needs. And if I don't process that, and I, and don't do it later, it stays. It stays as unprocessed, we call it energy or experience, and that lives in our body. It doesn't live sort of in our chest drawer over there or a closet. The only place it lives is here, and there's only so much storage space.
Yeah, so when that storage space gets full up, that's probably, I imagine, when things like breakdowns or psychosis or like more extreme events unfold and occur.
Yeah, and they don't have to even look like total psychosis. It can be fatigue. It can be sleep challenges. It can be, I got into a fight with someone and I didn't really truly mean it. Whatever it is, there's lots of ways it manifests in our life. It usually shows up as some type of disconnection of relationship to ourselves, others, the environment. Just to come back to this concept of, of recognizing when we are not in this cycle, when it's been built up with when the closet space is full, storage space is full. It can look like more and more disconnects, more and more disembodied experiences, where I suddenly am not able to be in relationship to nature or to myself, or I can't feel my body. All of those are sort of symptomologies way before the sort of major clinical symptomologies of like autoimmune, things like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, sleep disorders, all of which we know are deeply correlated to something called stress. It's just the correlation usually blame the stress as opposed to the obstacles of us processing it.
Yeah, which is that great distinction again. I get a real sense now of why society is the way society is, because over the last couple of 100 years, we've become increasingly industrialized, et cetera, and putting ourselves into all of these situations where there's far more situations of stress occurring and probably far more suppression of the cycle being completed. Whereas once upon a time, we would have lived in such a way that we were completing those things, you know, all the time. And so, of course, we are where we are.
Yeah. I mean, look at like, in my hometown in the United States, they cut gym classes and recess was shortened. And I'm just like, because of budget issues. And I'm just going, where do these kids get to mobilize this energy and process it? And there is, again, they're sitting in desk, and part of our nature is that this needs to move. Now, how it moves, that's a little more sophisticated, but it needs to essentially move. And to go back, I want to be really, I appreciate you sharing, and I'll just say, I remember a time when in my early 20s, and I had just started the School for Body Mind Centering, so my somatic therapy training, and I came back from it, and I was also in grad school, and I remember in grad school sitting and meditating in the middle of a very overwhelming class of information. I was like, I can do this. I'm a calm somatic practitioner. And I just remember it feeling like I'm not okay. And I just kept going, I'm okay. And I'm not feeling, and it just, and then I remember the teacher, who was so sweet, just tapped me on the shoulder and just said, and I was doing this, I thought I was, disguised and no one shouldn't me. And she just said, what if you just exhaled? And I just burst into tears in the middle of a class. And it really taught me a lot about I was really holding this posture of now that I'm a somatic practitioner and a yogi, this is how I hold myself and be in the world. And I'm not allowed to have this sort of inner inner dialogue of arousal and fear and all of these things. And I really, one of the things I've just, as I've gotten older, just been like, wow, this is what it is to be alive and human. Wow. And it just feels like I just have more capacity to meet it.
Yeah.
It doesn't, I don't feel like I'm a leaf blowing in the wind either. I'm not just swept up in a storm of my stress responses, my activations, or my anger, or my sadness. It just feels like a very beautiful, spacious permission and holding to make contact and meet it, to be informed about what might need to happen next.
Mm-hmm.
To stay in relationship, to be in this dance of life.
Yeah. So when people come and do your somatic stress release, it's a 5-day training, right?
Level
so are
one.
You level one is, so are you giving tools and techniques, and I mean obviously there would be the intellectual understanding, but tools and techniques for people to work with stuff that's come from a long time ago, that's stuck, and also to learn how to notice what's happening in the moment so that they can stay present and just allow it to complete.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And level one, I believe in experiential education. So if I talk about the nervous system, we're going to go and embody it. What does the sympathetic nervous system actually feel like, as opposed to some concept and me telling you what it is? Because already that categorization robs you of your empowered, embodied experience that then leads you into informed responses. And so experiential education in this way is a beautiful process of empowering you to be part of this dance of nature, essentially. So it's a very equal balance of bringing in the theoretical frameworks and the direct experiential learning, and tools, and I bring in a self-massage ball work technique that I devised from osteopathy. So I'm bringing that type of work of helping us mobilize our body in multitude of ways.
And so what kind of people show up on this training? Like, I imagine it's quite diverse, but who benefits most? Cool people. People who just want to hang out.
People just want to hang out. It's been really diverse and wonderful. It's a lot of yoga teachers, a lot of psychotherapists, kinesiologists, doctors. I love telling this. I had a banker come. She works in a bank, and she's like, I am bringing this back and working with people in the office and in the world of finance. And she has been doing that, which is really fun. And so it's a very diverse parents, people who are just like, whew, living as parents.
Yeah, the hardest job there is, I reckon.
I've had a lot of parents come in actually and say, like, I want to learn how to support my kids. I'm getting stressed out, they're stressed out, what do we do? And so there's parents who are coming in. I mean, this, it's a somatic training. It's body focused. We do some movement explorations. We do, it is more focused on diving into it and broadening our contact, our felt sense of our body from the inside, which is different than other, approaches that might be like learning alignment from the outside and other things like that.
So when I was reading through some of your stuff, one of the things that jumped out at me, I just looked at your Instagram, which is cool. And I don't think it's related to this particular training, but I wanted to ask you about it anyway. Learning to empower healthy boundaries. Now, boundaries is one of those words that, again, hear a lot. And I'd be really curious to know, like, what's the actual definition of a boundary? And like, where does it, like, what defines it? Where does it live? What's it made up out of it? And how do we control it or activate it? Or, what's the correct terminology when we're dealing with boundaries?
Well, I think it's important to identify that my definition of boundaries is informed by my experiences, which informs my sense of my boundary. So,
Mm-hmm.
if I give a definition, it doesn't mean that that's the right definition. It just means that this is my sort of research from my perspective, and it informs the way I work with people in boundaries. But I would never take away someone else's definition, because in the definition is embedded their lived experience of something called boundary or lack thereof. So,
Mm-hmm.
I was working with a patient the other day, and I asked her, well, what does boundaries mean for you? And she said, a very thick brick wall. And I was like, great, that's the working definition. As we play and explore this with this thing called boundaries, we can see does that feel right, or does that change in the nature of exploring it? For me, boundaries, we could talk about it as a semi-permeable membrane that essentially is a place that allows space. Again, there's that word space and permission for something to be, I would say, for something to basically be met and then have more time and space to meet it. Kind of without a boundary, it's like, so if we put our hand out like this, it already creates a sort of a pause point for us to have the initial meeting, which is the same thing our skin does. Yeah, our skin is the outermost membrane of our body. It's where the outer world meets the inner world. And so the skin, if you think about like an oil, the skin is that pause point where it's the first contact, as opposed to if we had no skin, it would just get much more quickly absorbed in, like a coconut oil, directly into the tissue. Having the skin slows down the absorption rate, which allows us to, like, oh, I'm going to go wash it off, or I'm going to put more on, or I'm starting to actually make more informed decisions based on this place of pause and reflection. So yes, I could say that about, I think it's more popular to say, like, my boundary is where I say no to things. But my boundary is also where I get to decide yes to things. It's not just a no, this is my boundary. It's this is my boundary that allows me to make contact, and then possibly deeper contact. It's the place where I am first informed of what I'm meeting. And then we go from there. Yeah.
Where do you find it? I know.
Yeah.
Is it the subtle body? Is it, I mean, because there's all these terms and that, and depending on which particular field you're coming from, there's different terms that sometimes overlap, sometimes don't.
I don't think there's one singular place you have to experience boundary. There are a multitude of boundaries in our body. We have this double lipid membrane of the cells. We have our skin. We have this sort of the sacs around the organs, like the heart, the sacs around the lungs. We could refer to a multitude of places where there's a pause to meet and make choice around deeper contact or absorption of information. Remember, a boundary is also what allows things to stay in.
Yeah.
Which is also a choice. And how much and at what rate things get moved out. The boundary, if we didn't have a cell membrane, what would be containing the cell? And what would, in that way, there's the membrane is moderating or modulating what comes in and what comes out, and at what rate. And when, and we see things like, like caffeine can degrade the membrane wall. I mean, that's some research. It can be argued. Don't worry, coffee drinkers, have your fun. But, in that degradation of the wall, of the membrane, we lose some of that semi-permeability, or that basically choice making or agency.
Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I asked was I worked with someone a few months ago, and one of her challenges was that when she was out and about in the world, no filters. She just felt overwhelmed because she could feel all of the stimuli, etc. And then when I was working with her, I said, "What does it feel like to?" And she's like, "Well, it feels like I go into infinity." And then we just kind of worked. I'm like, "How do I work with this?" And I do what I always do, which is kind of make it up. I just feel into it and go, "Let's experiment. What happens if you do this? And what happens if you do this?" And we did some stuff around it, and she was able to have a different felt experience just by literally feeling into it and inventing or creating a boundary for herself. And that intrigued me, because I was like, I mean, because from the perspective of consciousness is all, and when we drop down into that level of beingness, let me just feel into this. It's almost as if some people experience reality through that place where they can't distinguish any separation from all and themselves, which is not useful at certain points as such.
Yeah, I mean,
and then overwhelmed with information. It's like too much information, stimulation coming in, can't deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. There's one. There's a great quote. Is it by Don Johnson? I'm blinking on who wrote it. But by rubbing up against the world, I define myself to myself. And a boundary is the place where we're able to rub up against and meet something else. And when we look at a developmental process of learning the self, there's an inherent part of relationship that informs me of who I am and how I am. So a boundary can also be the place where we rub up against the world to define ourselves to ourselves, to be met by other, which is also on a very non-dualistic realm, us, but still a place that holds the mirror back to reflect back our how and who we are.
So for someone that doesn't that feels like they're going to infinity, there's nothing rubbing, there's no being met, it's just, and it feels incredibly.
Or there's lots of ways to work with that. Is it truly infinity? What happens when we go all the way out? What if the boundary was at the end point of the universe for that individual? It might seem far for us, but what if the boundary is at the end of the Milky Way, and can we feel it from that point, meeting the other elements of space? We might. This is a very humanistic approach where we might say, oh, the boundary should be here, and I teach that as that boundary as a kinesphere around us and work with it often, but I don't want to assume that has to be the normalization. I want to. It's like, okay, is it truly infinity? Is a really interesting question of how can we go out to that point of infinity and feel, is there a point where it ends? And sometimes the answer is no. And there are people in which boundary ruptures have been so severe that we lose that sense of that place where we can pause and have agency.
And so then it's restoring.
There's a process that could be about restoring the membrane.
It's an interesting thing to talk about because it seems so nebulous, or so because you can't necessarily see it, and yet
you can feel it.
You can feel it, It's
I can't see infrared, but I know it's there.
Yeah, totally. It's so awesome to talk to you again. I know we were going to keep this to about half an hour. I'm pretty sure that we're way over that. And I know we could just keep going on. Which is great. Well. I know, we do. So for those of you watching this, if you want to spend some time with Scott and deep dive into all of this stuff, you can feel, the depth of his knowledge and understanding from a really embodied experiential level. So on his website, which we will link to, there's all the information on the different things he's offering, not just somatic stress release. You've got one yin training coming up in
I have one
Sydney?
year training in Sydney, and then of course we have our umbrella school, Tara and I, of embodied flow, to
Mm,
which all of these sort of are housed under, and you know, our advanced yoga teacher training, our movement therapy training, and our 200-hour training.
yeah, epic. And do you still
Yeah,
do one-on-one work with people? Can people still contact you, or are you too
I
busy for that now?
yeah, I haven't taken new
Yeah.
patients in about a year or two.
Yeah, I figured that might be the case.
Yeah,
Awesome. Well, thank you again, as always. It's such a delight
my
to just
pleasure.
tap into your knowledge and understanding and perspective. So thank you for your generosity and sharing.
And you're so sweet. Thank you for your curiosity and your beautiful questions and
Mm.
following your own process with this. So thank you.
My pleasure.